Hi, everyone. We're so glad that you joined us today. I'm Elizabeth Woods. I'm a staff attorney here at Disability Rights New York State's protection and advocacy system for people with disabilities. I am a white woman in my early 40s with long brown hair and brown eyes. I'm wearing a black blazer and a black shirt, and I have a white wall in my background. I welcome you on behalf of the entire DRNY team to day 2 of the Never About Us Without Us Emergency Preparedness webinar series. Before we begin our climate change in the intersection of race, poverty, and disability session, I'm happy to introduce our keynote speaker today, Dr. Atiya Martin, the CEO and founder of All ACEs Incorporated. Dr. Martin, if you could please introduce yourself and provide a visual description.
Thank you so much for that, Elizabeth. My name is Dr. Atiya Martin. I am a Black woman who identifies ethnically as African American. I have shoulder length, curly, brownish, reddish hair. I have glasses on, and I am wearing a black and white pinstriped shirt with a pink scarf tie, a vest, a black vest. And in my background, there's too much stuff, lots of books and a globe and some awards. So thank you all for having me. For context on who I am, again, my name is Dr. Atiya Martin, and I, as the CEO of All ACEs Inc., am here to talk about the intersections of climate change, climate resilience, really, and disaster resilience, and how it impacts people of color, people with disabilities, in this very interesting intersection or overlap across them that sometimes gets lost in conversations. But before we go there, so that you have context on who I am, I was born and raised in the city of Boston. Both myself and my husband were born and raised in Boston. We have 5 children, 2 still at home. We have 3 grandbabies, now 4, just had added a 4th one. And this work of resilience, of racial justice, really has been an important part of my life, personally and professionally. As you all as parents, those of you who are parents know that being a parent is a tough job. And when you start to add in these layers of identities that our children hold, that the rest of the world will perceive them in a certain way, it's a tough job to add that layer to how do you prepare them to go out into the world and still thrive. And so much of my lessons around this work started from that place, and I continue to grow my skills and knowledge and apply it to the workplace context I was in across Homeland Security, the field of Homeland Security, not the Department of Homeland Security. So intelligence, emergency management, as well as public health preparedness and response. So much of what I'm sharing with you today comes from that lens. So I'm going to jump into the presentation, and I'm going to need your help with this presentation. So I'm so glad that the chat is active. So hopefully you all will be able to help me with this. So I know yesterday you had speakers who talked a lot about the challenges for people with disabilities as it relates to disaster response and recovery. And so we will be touching base on some intersecting themes, some overlapping themes, and identifying some of the operational and longer term planning opportunities to address some of the systemic challenges that many of the speakers yesterday spoke about in terms of how the traditional emergency management ecosystem is ill-prepared to support the needs of all the different requirements of communities, particularly people with disabilities. So with that said, I'm going to ask a question of folks. I said I need your help. And one of those questions is, what are the threats we face from climate change? What does it mean that we're facing climate change? And drop that in the chat, whatever comes to mind first. What does it mean that we're dealing with this threat of climate change? and specifically to the disabilities community. So drop that in the chat. More extreme weather events. Thank you. You get a virtual gold star, Jeremy, for being the first person to submit a response. I appreciate you. We also have Frank saying more difficult storms, right? So we have an increase of frequency and an increase of severity of the storms that we're going to have to deal with. Anything else? It means that redundancy is more important than ever. Yes, Karen. And redundancy is one of the 4 key principles of resilience that the nerds like me behind the scenes oftentimes refer to when we're thinking about what it means to be resilient. What are the characteristics, the consistent traits that we see in anything that we're describing as resilient? And so redundancy, this idea that we have multiple pathways to provide and continue to provide services, support, and address the challenges that communities are facing before, during, and after the disasters that we're dealing with. And when it comes to climate change and disasters, an important part of redundancy goes beyond the traditional emergency management ecosystem. And that was some of the things that came up yesterday as well. This idea that community partners, community organizations who are most connected to the disabilities communities and other identities that are underestimated in this society are important parts of the larger emergency management ecosystem. And that is where the redundancy is. Much of the redundancy beyond how we talk about redundancy when it comes to infrastructure and electricity, and even in our own homes with backup generators and things like that. But that's a critical part of resilience in this work and the impact, the increase of the need for redundancy because of climate change. Let's see, we also have Dr. Gui. I apologize if I'm just going to call you Dr. Laura because I can't ask you how to pronounce your name properly, and I don't want to do harm by destroying the pronunciation of your name. So I appreciate you extending me some grace. But Dr. Laura says, move fire, floods, or more fire, floods, et cetera, that threaten people who rely on others to move to safety. Yes, this increase in the actual preparedness and response needs because of this increase in severity and frequency. Air quality issues, transportation issues, food access issues, yes. And Teresa, we're gonna come back to that as we think about these intersections of race, poverty, and disability, and how it connects to these environmental justice and climate justice issues. So thank you for that, Teresa. So I'm gonna move forward because you all have began to lay the foundation for the thinking around climate and disaster resilience. And so since we've started down that path, I'm going to keep us moving there. Now, I know there are a lot of words on the screen, so I'm going to walk through this and break it down piece by piece. So the way that this definition for climate and disaster resilience is on the screen, it begins with the ongoing process. And there's some key words in there: ongoing, meaning we are always doing it, we never reach an endpoint, and process, meaning that it's not just a destination, but it is a combination of structure and actions that continue to help us do this work, right? It's an ongoing commitment. And though that ongoing process is meant to strengthen our collective capabilities is where we get into what we talked about just a few minutes ago around redundancy, right? This idea that all scale and levels of our society need to have certain capabilities to be able to respond to, recover from, help to mitigate, cope with, and adapt to climate change as well as the other threats. And the next piece around what is it about these particular threats, and including climate change, is particularly significant because it connects the dots between the day-to-day realities of communities and what happens when there are disasters, right? So this idea that these particular threats cause large-scale worsening of pre-existing social, so we're talking about people and the reality of how we've structured society and the power of people, environmental, economic, both large scale economic conditions, as well as our what they call microeconomic conditions, our household economic realities, infrastructure. So all the things that we depend on every day to live our daily lives, and governance conditions. Governance in this context is not about government. Government has governance, and that is basically how we make decisions. Governance is about how groups of people in organizations make decisions. And those organizations can be a group of people. It could be a small grassroots organization. And it could be a very large governmental bureaucracy, right? It could be any of these things, but in all of those spaces, there are decisions being made, and there are best practices for how decisions should be made. And so as we think about the social conditions, the environmental conditions, the economic conditions, the infrastructure conditions, and the governance conditions that existed before a disaster ever hit, before climate change impacts significantly increase, or as they're increasing, that all of those conditions are worsened. And that is the connecting point as we think about what happens after disasters and what is going on in people's lives and in communities before disaster, that all of those things are happening. And that resilience is not about bouncing back, which is in emergency management, as someone who worked in emergency management and in this Homeland Security space for 20 years, that's what emergency managers used to always say, and you'll still hear a number of folks saying it. It's about bouncing back. But really, we understand over time, and as we've evolved and grown and learned, and resilience has become more available in terms of the frameworks and our understanding of how it impacts us, that it's really about how we bounce forward. How do we make sure that at every opportunity, we're improving the day-to-day conditions of people's lives so that we can reduce the post-disaster impacts? So that's important. I wanted to spend some time with that because it's important framing as we think about priorities. So the intersection of poverty, disability, and race is really where I'm going to also sit, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what it means practically in terms of the challenges we see with emergency management. So we have this reality that people with disabilities are overrepresented in the larger category of people who live in poverty. So for context, just to set the backdrop, we know that the likelihood of having a disability increases with age. The numbers are around just over 5%, about 6% of young adults age 18 to 20 have a disability. And then when you compare that with the percentage of adults who are near retirement age, which near retirement age, because it's higher now, age 61 to 65. We know that you'll see chronic medical conditions such as diabetes, high blood pressure, back pain, anxiety, or depression. All of those things can lead to functional limitations over time. And in addition to the cumulative effects of inadequate nutrition, healthcare, stressful or unsafe work environments. And this whole piece around a number of other risk factors that ultimately increase the risk of disability over the lifespan. So people, as I mentioned earlier, people with disabilities are overrepresented in the population of people in America living in poverty. And when we look at that data, we're talking about the poverty rate for adults with disabilities is more than twice the rate of adults with no disability. And so some approximate numbers are around 27% of people with disabilities are 27% of the people living in poverty are people with disabilities, compared to 12% of people who do not have disabilities. And so the relationship between disability and poverty is complicated. There's no easy answer, but this idea of the relationship between people with disability being more likely to become impoverished, and people living in poverty are more likely to have or acquire a disability. It's this interconnected relationship that the research has been showing us. And so we know that disability leads or increases the likelihood of living in poverty because many people with disabilities have been excluded from the workforce in many different ways. And much of it, excluded is an intentional word because much of it is unnecessary in a lack of understanding or appreciation for what people bring to the table. And that also spills over into educational opportunities, as well as other institutional barriers that restrict people's earnings. And so that's kind of this overlay of people with disabilities and poverty, right? So then we look at, well, how does race, in terms of how we define it, play into this? So the poverty rate among people with disabilities, it varies dramatically by race and ethnicity. So African Americans are most likely to have a disability, 14%, followed by non-Hispanic white people, 11%, Latinx people or Latina people, 8%, and Asian Americans at 5%. Now, depending on what research you look at, you'll also see some pockets of higher percentages of Native American or indigenous peoples represented in the this overlap of poverty and disabilities. And then the other piece is the poverty rate, as I mentioned earlier, varies by race for people with and without disabilities. So almost 40% of African Americans with disabilities live in poverty, compared to 24% of non-Hispanic whites, white people, 29% of Latina or Latinx people, and 19% of Asian Americans. So people of color with disabilities face this double marginalization, and you can even say a triple marginalization if they're part of that large percentage of folks who are living in poverty. And so that discrimination and stigma that leads to that worse socioeconomic outcomes. So it's this very complicated stew of realities that people are dealing with in communities. And so we have this piece around, excuse me, my allergies are killing me today, y'all. So please, I apologize. My voice is usually not this nasally and I'm not usually coughing so much. So I appreciate you extending me some grace on that as well. But this where I was going is that when we look at Black people, Native American or indigenous populations, Latina, Latinx populations, Asian Americans, and Pacific Islanders, Pacific Islander people are overrepresented in both disability and poverty. So when you layer on top of disability and poverty, you see them represented in both categories. And again, this is due to a long history of policies and practices that our country has perpetuated in the past that continue to perpetuate today, in addition to creative and newer versions of perpetuation of oppression across different identities, in this case, race, because of racism. And so the data shows that Black people and Native American people or Indigenous peoples are the most overrepresented in both people with disabilities and poverty. So that's the lay of the land that we're dealing with in terms of how all of these different identities intersect with one another. And I just want to be clear about something because I have been in conversations about, excuse me, I'm going to do something that is related to my allergies, like my nose. So thank you for extending me some grace. But the reality here is that the way that the original or the origins of intersectionality really was a way to show how race creates these very unique experiences for all identities, whether they are a marginalized identity or whether they are what they call a dominant identity, that in all of those contexts, it creates a very unique experience. And so how do we understand the way that that influences the experiences folks have? And then you begin to layer all of the different identities that come together to create these very dynamic and unique experiences, and you can apply it to other contexts. I say that explicitly because in many conversations where race and racism specifically comes up, oftentimes intersectionality is used as a tool to not talk about racism. And so I just want to caution against that. And in this space of family and folks who really care about these issues, that we're able to not see the silos across issues, that we're able to see how they come together and connect in these very unexpected and dynamic ways that can lend the people to having very negative, compounded, complex experiences, and that everyone in a particular identity isn't having the same experience because of how these other identities play in, particularly race and racism. So with that explicitly named, I want to talk about the emergency management space and how emergency management talks about resilience and why it is challenging for those of us who want to see the work happen differently, the work happen in a way that's more inclusive, in a way that's more about collaboration and partnerships with communities and organizations working with communities, and how we're able to therefore be more effective in the work that we're doing and the limited resources that we have available to do this work. So some of you probably have seen this before. If you've been in the emergency management space, we recreated this and just added one more framework that wasn't on the original recovery continuum. And what you're seeing here is that there are these national frameworks for every part of the phases of emergency management. So phases of emergency management are specific to preparedness, mitigation, response, and recovery. Excuse me. So as we're thinking about all of those areas, there's actually national frameworks for each category. And they vary across each of those types of categories, vary in terms of how they show up in the timeline that we are usually looking at after a disaster. So we know preparedness is usually before a disaster. That's everything that we do before there's a disaster in order to be able to respond and recover well. That's what preparedness is connected to. Then for the response the mitigation piece. It's about what are the things that we can do in our communities that will reduce the impact of disasters beyond response and recovery. Sometimes it's infrastructure investments. Sometimes it is related to investing in communities, investing in social infrastructure, investing in social capital, community leadership. That's less often happening, but that too is mitigation. And so I just want to pause for a moment because I am paying attention to the chat. And Shane is asking, thank you for a great presentation. Would I mind speaking about my personal relationship with disability? I ask because as a person with a disability, it's important that we speak about and for our community. We also own our membership in that community. So we speak from a place of authenticity. It's important that we see ourselves in this space. Thank you. Thank you, Shane, for holding me accountable. I love to be held accountable, even though it's uncomfortable sometimes. So I appreciate you for that. And so for me, I have multiple disabilities, hidden disabilities that sometimes show up. And require me to take time from my traditional work life. My family, we have people in our children in our family who are on the autism spectrum. I myself am included in that, and as well as my husband. And so there are a number of different intersections that I have with disabilities, both cognitive and physical. So I hope that helps to amplify what you were saying in the chat, Shane, and thank you again for asking me those questions. Appreciate you. So that said, I am going to shift us from this piece around response and recovery, mitigation, preparedness, and jump into those 5 things I mentioned that are the conditions we need to be paying attention to pre-disaster, because those are the things that will be worsened post-disaster. And so we know that in an ideal world, we would always center people in the middle on top of everything, that we would always center people who, how all of the different dynamics in people's lives and realities actually relate to all the other different types of resilience that people are oftentimes trying to work towards. So there are people who are like, we are about environmental resilience. And there are other people who are all about infrastructure resilience or critical infrastructure protection. You have people who are more on the economic resilience side of the house, or focused on economic things. And you have people who are really dealing with how do we bring people together to work collectively on issues and share decision-making power and leverage best practices for how we make those decisions. And in all of those cases, the goal is that we center people in their identities in this work. Why? Because if you're designing anything, a plan, a project, a policy, a program, that in all of those instances, that we are able to understand who is our target audience. And if we want to accomplish equity, then making sure that we understand the diversity in our communities is paramount, number one. But number two, those are our partners in governance. Those are our partners in actually making decisions if we're doing this well, because they are the context experts. Right? So those of us in emergency management, the professionals, the folks who have all the answers, we are the content experts. We know the structures and the stuff, but our community partners, our other non-traditional emergency management partners, including the private sector, those are our context experts. They're the ones who are navigating and having to respond and recover post-disaster and need to be a part of everything in preparedness, which we'll show here in a second. Excuse me. So with that, you can't develop good policies, practices, or programs across any resilience category if you don't have context experts involved in the process, and as many diverse voices as possible, because no one person or organization speaks for all people. We have a number of, particularly when we're talking about at the local level, it's very important to have as many voices as possible at the table. And so this centering of people in how we make decisions that impact those populations is critical. So we know this intellectually. We talked about it a lot in in the traditional emergency management spaces, but we haven't gotten good at actually doing it. So, and here's what it looks like, and here are some opportunities where we can do it better. And we heard some of these things yesterday for those who joined yesterday. But I'm going to reiterate a couple of things because they're amazing opportunities for us to do better and be better in this work, and really look more towards disaster and climate resilience way of thinking. So preparedness, right? That's all the plans that people are going to use. That's how the work is going to be structured. What are the structures that are going to be created to then implement the plans? What equipment and supplies are needed in order to implement the plans and to leverage the structure to do that work? What is the training that happens that allows people to practice with all of the stuff and with the structures or organization and with the plans that we say we're going to implement? And once we know, have training, and training is extensive. One training isn't enough, right? So you're talking about a long-term investment in training, and then we have to practice. Once we learn these skills, right, we have to keep practicing them. And when we have disasters, we need to evaluate them. And in each of those categories, there are these amazing opportunities for emergency management to do things differently. So how we do planning, I won't spend too much time on this because it was talked about quite extensively yesterday. But what I will say is there's a foundational challenge in some jurisdictions with even being able to access plans, even though if you, based on FEMA guidelines, you're supposed to share those plans, at least a sanitized version of those plans without revealing sensitive information, but you're supposed to share those plans and make it easily available to the community, which means not just putting it on the website, which some jurisdictions don't even do that. You have to call them and request it and wait for them to get around to getting you as an individual a copy of the plan if you ever get it, or you have to make a request through formal channels to get a copy of it. In addition to that reality, we have opportunity to make sure it's accessible across all different communities, right? So accessible across all different sensory disabilities, all different cognitive disabilities, the people who care for us in our day-to-day lives. We have an opportunity to make sure that not just that people have access to it, but they have influence on those plans. But in order to influence them, we have to have access to them and know what's even in there to begin to be a part of a process. And it has to be in a format that is that allows us to actually process the information. Another opportunity here is around language justice. Right? What are the ways that we can take content and make sure that it's available across different languages, and even the intersection of kind of disability and language justice? Like how do we make things accessible to people so that they can fully participate in the process? Interactional justice, or in other words, how we're treated in processes, and our access, our ability to actually access information that is related to a process we care about or have been invited to, is critical here, because what institutions are doing without explicitly meaning to do it in most instances is they are creating experiences that communicate to people that they don't matter, that their voices don't matter, that their presence in being even considered in these plans is invisible. It communicates and reinforces what they call institutional betrayal. This idea that we have to be in relationship with these organizations and institutions, and we have had so many negative experiences with institutions and have been harmed by them, but yet and still we can't get out of the relationship, right? And so it's this perpetual sense of being harmed by institutions, but it doesn't have to be that way, right? And planning is an amazing opportunity for the traditional emergency management system to take a step back and really look at ways that they can have that context expertise, really make sure that their plans will work when there is an actual disaster. So that customization of plans to match the communities that we're serving is critical. How we structure our incident command system and all of our other response structures. So these are the ways that emergency management brings different organizations together to collaborate with one another. Well, wouldn't it be amazing if there was always a place in any of the incident command system structures, whether it's in an emergency operations center or post-disaster in the short-term and long-term recovery, in the recovery support functions, that there was always a place for different organizations that represent people with disabilities, that represent different racial, ethnic groups, folks who are able to advocate and remind people of the things that get forgotten when we are under pressure. Right, so this accountability role is an important place for organizations to fill because government and any institution needs accountability, right? We need to know that people are paying attention and that we're in partnership, because we both, in an ideal world, for the most part, we both want the same things. We both want to accomplish the mission well. And so making sure that we integrate that into our emergency operations center, and even as we think about traditional response and recovery operations, how do we make sure that we actually have equipment that matches all of the different needs that our community members have, everything from stair chairs to making sure that we have bariatric chairs, making sure that we have all of the different equipment across all of the different needs that are representative in that community. But again, that's why planning is so important, because it allows you to have those context experts with you up front before we've invested millions and millions of dollars in equipment and hadn't integrated these things. And every cycle of funding is an opportunity for investing in the equipment and supplies that actually will support communities. The training component is, wouldn't it be amazing if there were community partners involved in some of the trainings that were happening around how we are going to be doing response and recovery work, particularly community-based organizations who are going to be expected to play a support role in the short term in particular, and some who are going to be involved in the intermediate and long term as well. And that reality of the role of these organizations, even if they are not officially part of any incident command system, they are still doing work in communities that is oftentimes invisible. So how about we figure out what kind of training would support them to be most effective and efficient with their limited resources? And how do we collaborate better when we have to do mass care services or have to shelter people and feed people in an emergency shelter situation? And how do we do that in a way that actually meets the broad range of needs in communities? This is not easy work. There's no easy button. That's why the planning part is so important, because it's not just about the output of the plan. It's about the knowledge and relationships that get built that support our ability to do response and recovery so much better. That allows us to to make sure that as we're doing this work and we're planning and we're making investments, that we're being smart about the investments. Equity is in order to achieve equity, it has to be intentional. It will never happen by accident. It has never happened by accident. In fact, without intentionality, we are most likely being inequitable or running processes and systems and programs that are unjust. So this opportunity across training and exercises to integrate community partners across the spectrum who are already providing services. And we're in close relationship with communities, making sure that individuals in communities who are supporting people with disabilities across a broad range of identities, that they have access to what it is expected of them, and what is it that they can empower them. And let me reframe, because empower, I always struggle with that word, but that will allow them to leverage the power that they have always had, but we're inviting them into a more just process by providing materials and resources that support their ability to leverage that power. But people can't do things that they don't know about. And so the training piece, as well as how we practice the way we're going to do emergency response, matters. How we're going to do this long-term recovery piece matters. And so as we think about the short-term, intermediate, and long-term, I just want to flag that in the short term, that's usually where there's the most resources, right? We have a colleague in another hat I wear as my nonprofit, Next Leadership Development, convenes Black-led organizations, historic Black towns, and researchers and a number of folks from across the country. And one of our it's called the Black Resilience Network. And one of our members always says this. He's been involved in dozens and dozens of response in recovery efforts as a community organization, right? As a larger organization, small community organization that crosses state boundaries is the best way to describe it. And oftentimes he'll talk about kind of day 31. It's like the first 30 days, there are all these resources. There's so many people who kind of descend upon a jurisdiction, and our ability to manage those resources well is critical. Have volunteer reception centers that prepare people to support the community in a way that they actually need, which again, ideally was thought about in preparedness, but if not, some just-in-time work still can be helpful. But that first 30 days to maximize all of those resources that come in, but also make sure that there are organizations that are representative of the community as a part of that 30 days. But then day 31 happens and most of those resources bungee out. But when you have community partners involved who are connected to organizations, they're still there. And they're going to be there in the intermediate and in the long term. And so this connection back to how we plan and how we prepare, bigger picture, is critical for our success in not just the short term, but in the long term. We're involved, the Black Resilience Network is involved in the Mississippi tornado response from the March 24th and 25th tornado that hit the Delta area. And a lot of what we are asking questions about and bringing to the table really are questions that are at this intersection of making sure that poor community members are being supported, people living in poverty, that people of color, our focus is on Black people, but we care about the context of the larger community, but we're laser beam focused on what's happening with Black people in the area because they get lost in the process, and what's going on with people with disabilities, like where is the intentionality? Because as we know, that window to get access to FEMA resources comes with a deadline. And so after that deadline, it becomes incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to access the resources, which means that short-term to intermediate period is the only real window that people have to apply for individual assistance across all the different agencies. And so our ability to be intentional about who the people are in communities who will most need these resources, and how do we deal with the complexity of people's lives, people who don't have documentation of their homes in these very kind of narrow ways, those types of things. And how do we make sure that there's this whole, the volunteer organization active in disaster structure that comes in to support all this work is prepared to actually meet those needs of communities in the short term, in the intermediate, and even in the longer term, because of the ways that a number of those organizations are structured across the country with their kind of state and local offices. So our ability to have them partnering with community-based organizations, and we're making sure that those organizations and community members are getting access to actual money and resources for their role they're playing in building redundancy in communities before, during, and after disasters. Last thing I'll say on this slide is there's also a I think a huge opportunity in the preparedness side here, right? So if we know that there are some people in communities who don't have insurance, who are living in poverty, those types of things, we know that they're going to struggle the most post-disaster and need the most support in navigating and accessing FEMA resources and HUD resources and SBA resources, the Small Business Administration, the Housing and Urban Development Agency, kind of these big federal agencies that have a lot of bureaucracy and there's a lot of paperwork involved. How do we support people in navigating and making sure they get everything that they need, but they understand what are the things they can do beforehand? How do we help people in their pre-existing conditions and situations across those categories to be more prepared for what they're going to face when disasters happen, particularly as we think about areas of the country that are being devastated on a regular basis by disasters. So these opportunities for equity and justice, I'm just going to be high level about this because I've talked about them in different ways and talking about the opportunities across the different areas of the preparedness, response, recovery, and things we can do in mitigation. But these equity and justice opportunities are ways to make sure that we have just processes so that we can have equitable outcomes, right? Again, without that intentionality, we're not going to get to equity. So for every process, whether it's response related, recovery related, mitigation, or preparedness, that we always have representation of the most underestimated identities in a community, folks who have been historically marginalized, continue to be marginalized. So we want to have that representation because it's going to keep us accountable to recognizing them as priority populations. And when I say priority populations, I don't mean that they're more important than everybody else. Their situations are more complex. You want to have the most complex situations because it means the systems and structures and everything that we create from there is going to be more sophisticated and therefore able to handle the broad range of needs across different communities. So the representation is key. Practices. So what are the things that we do when we're running these processes that are going to make sure that people have a good experience? So what are the things that we're doing as a part of the process? Everything from how much time we give people, to our policies, to the way the programs that we're rolling out are able to support the needs of different folks, but those practices are critical. Access is an important part of that, making sure that there's a broad range of access to all of the things that we're doing across the entirety of a process, from planning all the way through to implementation. How we treat people, right? I mentioned that earlier. How we treat people matters in processes. Quality, that the people doing the work have experience and are knowledgeable and are willing to collaborate, and that the practices we're using are based on what we understand to be promising and best practices, and are aligned with research and data, including narrative data from communities. And lastly, distribution. And that distribution of resources and time is not limited to the outcome of the process, but that how we distribute resources matters throughout the process from beginning to end. So that's more of the theoretical pieces that I was speaking to as I was talking about some of the practical opportunities. So thank you all so much for listening and for your grace that you have extended to me during this time. I appreciate you all, and I think it's time for questions. Is that all right? Is that right, Elizabeth?
That is right. And we have a couple questions from our audience. Thank you, Dr. Martin, for your presentation. So Sylvia Murdolo asks, is there a difference between coordination and collaboration? The county's Emergency Operations Center is considered a coordination point.
Yes, coordination and collaboration are different. Coordination really just means that we're sharing information with you, and we are, there might be some exchange of resources. But when we collaborate with people, we're really talking about the decision-making process. We're talking about how we are thinking about how we make decisions about how we share the resources and information. So I hope that's helpful. That's just, I like to try to use simple language, and that's the simplest way to describe the difference. So it's really the difference is partnership, real partnership in decisions.
And we have a question from Jeremy Demick. And Sylvia says, thank you. Jeremy asks, how do we deal with disagreements that show up among groups coordinating assistance?
How do we handle disagreements that show up with groups handling assistance? That is a big one. So there's no easy answer. There are lots of dynamics that play out, but one of the key things that I've seen that has been helpful is to bring people together and remind them of the mission that we're all trying to accomplish. Right? The mission is paramount, and that we're clear that the mission requires us to excuse me, make sure that everything that we're doing gets to all the people who need it. And so if we're anchored in that as a principle, it makes our ability to get regrounded and come back to, even though we might be having a disagreement, let's remember what we're supposed to be doing here. What does the data tell us? Again, the numbers and the narratives that we understand about communities and the relationships that we have. How does that inform what we should be doing, and not just what we think we should be doing because we've done this before and we have all this experience, but having the humility to each organization, helping people to have some humility and recognizing that we don't have all the answers, no matter how experienced we are. Every context is different, which is why context experts are so important. So I would say that, and then the last thing is for conflict management in general. There's usually, in addition to egos, there's usually an issue of really hearing each other and what positions people have taken versus what we think people are saying and the positions that they're taking. So there's a whole piece around really listening and peeling behind the surface of not just the words people are saying, but what they mean when they say those words. That's where a lot of miscommunication and conflict comes from.
Does anyone else have any questions for Dr. Martin? If so, you can put them in the Q&A.
Thank you. Oh, and one more thing I will say about conflict among support agencies. And I assumed with support agencies that the reference was potentially to kind of the organizations who are providing services. in response. But I think it's really important that the local level has strong structure and process in place and take a leadership role in collaboration with the different stakeholders of community-based organizations, working most closely with people with disabilities and communities of color and people living in poverty. And that will help to let everybody else know who comes to the table that there is a structure and a process for how we're going to do this, and that no one organization is going to kind of derail our focus on making sure that we are going with the data, the information, the community partnership, and the context expertise necessary to do the work.